Not hearing anything.
Not hearing.
I'm not hearing either.
Viruses are harmful to a particular body, but paradoxically, they help us to understand the workings of the human body. And similarly, a virus pandemic is an opportunity for us to understand the workings of society. I'm Damien King. I'm the Executive Director of the Caribbean Policy Research Institute, which is an independent think tank dedicated to using evidence-based research towards improved public policy making in the Caribbean. Today, Caribbean societies are riven with inequalities and inequities. Sadly, COVID has exposed and exacerbated these problems. We have done research and we are presenting a report to examine the extent and degree of this phenomenon, and we try to draw lessons that can inform policy decisions. This research is made possible by the generous support of the people of the United Kingdom. After the opening protocols, we are going to present a summary of this report, insult to injury, the impact of COVID-19 on vulnerable persons and businesses in the Caribbean. The presentation is going to be made by CAPRI Research Fellow, Miriam Self, coming to us from Arima in Trinidad. Joining a discussion afterwards will be Audrey Deere-Williams, who is the Chief Technical Director from the Ministry of Labour and Social Security in Jamaica, and Elbert Ellis, a social analyst at the Caribbean Development Bank in Barbados. The discussion will be moderated by Marla Dukaran, Chief Economist at BIT and an economic consultant. She is joining us from Barbados. But first, we asked Sharon Weber, who is the governance advisor on the Caribbean Development Team at the British High Commission in Jamaica, to make some remarks. Sharon?
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. King. I want to just express my delight at being part of this, to be part of this event this evening. The Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, the FCDO, has had a very long partnership with CAPRI to support research on some of the most critical development challenges facing Jamaica. The findings have generated much public debate and have been valuable inputs to policy development. With the onset of the pandemic, of course, the FCDO turned once again to CAPRI to examine its impact on some of the most vulnerable groups here in Jamaica and in the wider region. The presentation this evening is the first of 5 research papers which will emerge from this partnership. Its regional focus will share a number of insights which have been garnered in the months immediately following the pandemic. Just like the past, we expect that the findings will heighten public awareness and generate extensive debate, and will also provide very useful and valuable input to policy development. On behalf of the FCDO and the British High Commission here in Kingston, I just wish to thank Dr. Mariam Self, lead researcher, Dr. King and his team from CAPRI, also the moderator, and this evening's panelists who will share their perspectives on the findings. I look forward to the discussion, and I hope you do too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Weber, and also thank you to Dr. King. So basically, good evening, everyone. I'm Marla Dukaran, and I would like to welcome all of our live viewers on YouTube. As Dr. King outlined, we will have Ms. Miriam herself give us a 15-minute presentation on the findings and recommendation of the report. And then after that, we will have 2-minute responses and remarks from the panel members, Ms. Audrey Dare-Williams and Mr. Elbert Ellis. So right now, I would like to invite everyone to participate in our discussion by sending questions to us on slido.com. So what you need to do is go to your browser and go to slido.com, enter the event code CAPRI, C-A-P-R-I, pose questions as you like, or vote up existing questions and participate in our polls. So I think our first poll should be up shortly. It's for number 1 is please rate your knowledge of the impact of COVID-19 on marginalized groups in the Caribbean. So you can go over to Slido and have a look there. So right now, I would just like to introduce our main presenter. She's the lead researcher at CAPRI, Miss Miriam Self. And Miriam will give us her presentation now. Thank you.
Ria, a 35-year-old mother of 6-year-old Peter and 8-year-old Sam, was employed as a room attendant at a well-known hotel in the Caribbean. On March 11, 2020, with COVID-19 being declared a pandemic. Like for many of us around the world, life for Ria and her children changed drastically. Just 1 week after this, as Caribbean countries began to close their borders and lockdowns and curfews ensued, Ria was put on short work hours by her employer. She felt like this was simultaneously a blessing and a curse. On the bright side, Ria was happy to be at home more often in order to help her children log into online school and focus on their online classes, given the sudden shift to remote schooling. On these days, her 6-year-old could log into classes from her phone, while her 8-year-old used a laptop loaned to her by a friend. On the other hand, few work hours meant that Ria was receiving reduced income. Just 2 weeks after being placed on short hours, Ria was put on furlough without pay, and within 3 months of the COVID-19 related restrictions, she became jobless as the hotel began laying off employees as there was simply no work. Ria looked for and applied for many jobs, and though she did not find a new job, she thought that it was for the best, as she did not have anyone to take care of her children and to help them with online school. She then became reliant on government social assistance to obtain food. Thankfully, the government of her country instituted COVID-19 related measures to help vulnerable persons amid the stringent containment measures. For the period within the first 3 months of the pandemic, when Ria was unable to earn an income, she benefited from a temporary government income support grant. Though less than her minimum wage salary, it helped her to meet her and her children's basic needs. Subsequent to that, with no system in place in her country for her to benefit from unemployment insurance, Ria is now without savings, without a job, without income, and with limited access to social protection. Ria is stressed and always worrying. Ria's situation is not unique. It is one faced by many in the Caribbean and highlights just part of the reality that women as a vulnerable group continue to face amid the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Too many in the Caribbean, individuals and small businesses, went down the path that Ria did. We need to know who they are, where they are, and how they coped, in order that we may better help them this time and next time. The pandemic is affecting everyone in some way, but some far more than others. Let's take, for instance, women. Their pre-existing inequalities have made them more susceptible to negative impacts of the pandemic. In looking at the pre-COVID situation of women in the Caribbean, we found that women were more vulnerable than men as they experienced inequalities that made them more likely to earn low incomes, have less access to social protection, and be more disposed to unemployment. The pre-COVID gender disparities are evidenced, firstly, by a higher unemployment rate for women, which stood at 10% compared to a rate of 6% for men in the Caribbean region. Also, data from 6 Caribbean countries show that on average, women earn less than men, particularly when controlling for education. Furthermore, women are more likely than men to work in accommodation and food services, a proxy of employment in the tourism sector, a sector which is susceptible to the local and global shocks, such as the current pandemic. Additionally, a pilot time use survey conducted in Jamaica in 2018 showed that women spent almost 3 times the amount of time as men on unpaid domestic and care work. Moreover, a 2016 country gender assessment done for the Caribbean found that female-headed households are more likely to be poor than male-headed households. And lastly, between 20 and 35% of women in the Caribbean are subject to different types of violence, including physical, sexual, psychological, and economic. Given this multi-layered set of inequalities faced by women, we examine how the pandemic has worsened their situation in the Caribbean. From a survey conducted during August 15th to September 4th, 2020, with 442 households within 4 Caribbean countries, Jamaica, Antigua and Barbuda, Barbados, and Trinidad and Tobago, we found that women who were already experiencing multidimensional inequalities have faced a wider degree of adverse impacts than men. In particular, we found that increased care work rendered them unable to work in many instances. 11% of all respondents, men and women, reported being unable to work due to increased care work. But women experienced this more than 2.5 times more than men. Also, female-headed households have faced greater permanent layoffs, and were almost twice as much affected as men, with the situation being more severe for female-headed households, as 16% of female-headed households experienced permanent unemployment, compared to 9% of male-headed households. Moreover, loss of jobs in the tourism sector in the Caribbean is likely to affect women disproportionately, given that they are highly represented in jobs such as accommodation and food services. Besides women, other vulnerable groups are being adversely impacted, as similar to women, their pre-existing vulnerabilities have been exacerbated in the context of the pandemic. This is seen in the following cases. Children who are now deprived of quality education. Learning from home has hurt the majority of students. From our survey, the greatest challenges reported included difficulty in focusing on schoolwork at home. This was experienced by 34% of children. Another 21% of children lacked access to internet, and 17% of them had no electronic devices access. Also, youth were already overrepresented among the unemployed, with a ratio of 3 youth to 1 adult. They are now impacted by the loss of opportunities for quality social connections, practical skill training, which is likely to further limit their access to the job market. The poor, already with insufficient resources from which to purchase food and to make healthy food choices, have now been disproportionately affected in their diminished consumption of food. 29% of respondents from poor households had to reduce the number of meals and/or the portion of meal they would usually eat, compared to 17% of non-poor households. Informal workers, with their fragile employment situation, are likely to experience greater economic insecurity than formal workers in the context of limited or no social insurance, government-mandated lockdowns, and job losses without compensation. Small businesses have struggled to adapt their operations to leverage electronic and online platforms amid mobility restrictions, as more than half of the small businesses reported making no adjustments to sales strategies during the lockdowns, bringing into question their continued sustainability. Caribbean governments have responded to the impact of the pandemic on vulnerable groups, though not in a homogeneous way. They've utilized a range of social protection measures to provide food support, utility support, free training programs, and short-term income loss support in some cases, among other measures. This support has helped to cushion the effects of the pandemic for many groups. For instance, poor households, female-headed households, and those with children were primary beneficiaries of food support. Yet, some vulnerable communities who are in need have not been able to benefit. Therefore, the report highlighted a number of gaps in government's response, and here we mention a few. In the area of social protection, we found that social assistance is not reaching a substantial portion of vulnerable persons. A greater proportion of the poor and households with children, respectively, reported a need for social assistance but were unable to benefit from it. And this was seen as 46% of poor households and 66% of households with children reported a need for social assistance but were unable to access it. Identifying some vulnerable persons was a challenge. According to one ministry official, with the absence of data, we face difficulties in identifying who are the vulnerable people. This has been echoed by many government officials who made the point that there is a need for additional data to be collected on vulnerable persons, and that a social registry would be a key tool in helping them to streamline the need for and allocation of support. Care duties, especially with children being schooled from home, conflict with the ability of parents to work, especially mothers. This is compounded where daycare centers remain closed, where some employers do not utilize work from home policies, and where workers are unable to work from home based on the nature of their job, such as personal services. Also, there are gaps in support available to small businesses. Most small businesses, despite the measures offered by governments, are excluded as beneficiaries from measures such as cash payments or employee retention grants or loans and tax credits. Our survey highlighted that small businesses, especially informal ones, are inhibited in accessing benefits because more than half of the small businesses surveyed had no business registration. Therefore, they are ineligible to apply for grants or loans with a registration component or requirement. 25% of the small businesses do not file tax returns. Therefore, the tax credit is not helpful to them. Yet, 16.5% of business owners indicated the need for loans. In light of these gaps, it is clear that vulnerable communities must be greater considered, targeted, and reached. For an inclusive policy response that considers, targets, and reaches the vulnerable groups, including children, women, the poor, informal sector workers, and small businesses, out of a larger number in the report, the following recommendations are being highlighted. Firstly, assemble a social registry which is digital, integrated across agencies, interoperable with other databases, and dynamically maintained to enable automatic checks and screenings of eligibility for benefits. Secondly, in the absence of a social registry, use alternative and multiple sources of data to identify vulnerable households, such as electricity consumption, applications for unemployment benefits, or data from recent household censuses. Provide extended food support to households with women, including pregnant and lactating mothers and children. Fourthly, provide daycare vouchers for low-income parents who are working, especially women. With consideration for COVID-19 health protocols, open daycare centers where they are closed. Fifthly, partner with NGOs, development agencies, and commercial banks to create an accessible framework or mechanism for enabling small businesses to conduct business processes online, such as a shopping platform, including a payment facility. The pandemic is not over, and the situation faced by vulnerable groups lingers and could possibly worsen. Therefore, governments must keep a focus on centering those on the margins as they continue to make policy that affect not only substantial segments of populations, but the wider society.
Thank you so much, Ms. Miriam Self, for your presentation. We will now switch to the panel, but before we get to that, I would like to invite our audience to send your questions and your feedback on the presentation on Slido. Again, go to slido.com, enter the event code CAPRI, C-A-P-R-I, and you can post your questions or vote up questions that are already there. And you can also participate in the poll. We have a second poll, and it is, do you have a better understanding of COVID-19's impact on marginalized populations in the Caribbean? So that was me just checking the polls there. So let's switch now to the panelists. As Dr. King mentioned earlier, we have Mrs. Audrey Dare Williams, the Chief Technical Director at the Ministry of Labor and Social Security in Jamaica. And we have afterwards Mr. Elbert Ellis. He is a social analyst, social director, sector division, projects department at the Caribbean Development Bank. I now switch to Mrs. Audrey Dare Williams so that she can give us her 2-minute remarks. Thanks. Ms. Williams, we're not hearing you.
Sorry about that. I thought I was unmuted. Yes, so let me say again, thank you to Ms. Dukran. Thank you to CAPRI for inviting me. I feel like a regular now, I guess, because I am one of the chief technical directors in the Ministry of Labor and Social Security, and I do sit in the Social Security Division. I welcome the opportunity to be a part of this event, because I do recall speaking to Ms. Self while she was doing her research. I'm not sure I'm the ministry person she referred to, but I do recall being a part of that process. So I think we can all agree that COVID-19 is not just a public health crisis, but an economic crisis as well. Early evidence shows that economic impact of COVID-19 is being borne to a large extent by the poor. Governments have been constrained to respond both to the health crisis as well as the economic crisis. There has been much focus placed on protecting the most vulnerable in society. In my own ministry, our focus has been on addressing the need for more food by persons who were quarantined, elderly persons who are unable to access food. We also address the needs of the poorest who are beneficiaries of the PATH program. In order to ensure that payments were made to our beneficiaries, we waived the conditionality requirements, and we made an additional payment in May of last year. We increased the back to school grant that is typically paid with our August payment,
that was increased from $3,500 per child to $8,500 per child. We have also worked with the Ministry of Education on ensuring that the children who are not in school, the past children who are not in school because schools are closed, still are able to get their school feeding allotment. So that we have worked with Ministry of Education to ensure that it is dispersed with the path payment. So as a ministry and a government, we have been very active, I believe, in our response. And I must say, I do have a little bit of difficulty with the title, adding insult to injury, because I think our response has not been perfect, but it has been wide scale, and it perhaps does not reflect accurately what is happening on the ground. Nevertheless, I look forward to hearing from the other panelists and to hear feedback from your audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Audrey Dare Williams. I now invite Mr. Elbert Ellis to give his remarks.
Good evening, all. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to CAPRI for inviting me here to participate in this discussion. COVID-19 poses unparalleled challenges to the region's socioeconomic development, as demonstrated by the presentation that went before. Based on experiences to date and research findings, COVID-19 impacts are being manifested through compromised health systems, loss of income and livelihoods due to increasing unemployment, as well as significant pressure on and disruptions to already overburdened social protection systems. The restrictions on movement, travel, and curfews in countries in the region, including their trading partners, continue to fuel job loss and reduce income for workers across the formal and informal sectors, contributing to sluggish economic recovery and diminished prospects for inclusive growth. These disproportionately include workers in the tourism and hospitality sectors, and those who are, and women particularly, who are overly represented in those sectors. Vulnerable segments of the population who were displaced from the labor market as a result of previously implemented or ongoing adjustment programs are very likely to experience further hardship. The pandemic has affected all aspects of our economies and societies through its impacts on social capital, livelihoods, government revenues and expenditures, and business activity. Clearly, the severity of the impact is varied based on a range of pre-existing vulnerabilities of various groups, as well as different ways in which the pandemic has changed social and economic conditions. The vulnerable groups inordinately impacted include female-headed poor households, the elderly, youth, and persons with disabilities whose well-being is under threat. The intersectionality of inequalities experienced by disadvantaged groups across variables such as gender, race, class, disabilities in the midst of COVID-19 must be properly examined and the findings factored into appropriate national policy responses. To do otherwise would likely result in further marginalization of these groups of persons, possibly increasing their over-reliance on state resources and on others for support. Further, these consequent pressures may encourage the use of negative coping mechanisms, such as involvement in antisocial behaviors and crime and violence and other social maladies, which have ensnared a disproportionate segment of the region's youthful population, particularly our young men. COVID-19 has created a sense of despair and uncertainty. It has laid bare, and in many cases, worsened existing structural inequalities and increased the likelihood that the region may not achieve their nationally identified development objectives, nor the targets agreed in the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. I'm pleased to report that the Caribbean Development Bank is very active in its response and helping its board member countries across the region to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. And in so doing, we are helping them to build resilience in their social protection systems to ensure that when another crisis comes, they are better prepared to help the populations to bounce forward and to strengthen their resilience in the face of adversity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Elbert Ellis. So we will now take questions from our audience using Slido for this Q&A segment, which will run for about 15 to 20 minutes. Included in this Q&A session, we will have Ms. Miriam Self as well as the two panelists that you just heard. I will switch now to look at the questions that are coming through on Slido, and I will just go in order from the top. And each of you from the panel can answer the question, can respond as you see fit. The first question is, do you have information on the impact on persons with disabilities?
Thank you for that question. So persons with disabilities was not one of the central first vulnerable groups that we selected, but they are certainly a vulnerable group. For purposes of the research, we had to limit the number of groups, but we did mention the impacts on vulnerable groups based on other research that is already available. So we know persons with disabilities, for example, children with disabilities would certainly be affected. And in terms of the reach that governments have with them right now, they are affected. So the research speaks to some of it, but we did not do surveys, for instance, with them because there were limitations in that regard. The surveys actually happened at the time when there were a lot of lockdowns. So we did in-person surveys at that time. And we unfortunately, at that time, we did not do persons with disabilities, but it is certainly mentioned in the report.
Thank you, Ms. Self. The second question, given the border restrictions, how can the international community practically assist in the Caribbean in the short term when tourism really isn't a viable option? Remittances, of course, come to mind, but I will throw it to the panelists if anybody wants to take that.
I can go ahead, Chair.
Sure.
Thank you. The question is absolutely pertinent, and the international community would really want to support the initiatives that have been identified at the local level. A number of countries across the region have indicated to their populations where they want to go and the types of programs they want to implement. And the international community, in the spirit of partnership, would be able to partner and support those initiatives as identified. Here in Barbados, we know that we have opened back our airport. There are efforts on the way to really revitalize the economy and to give persons an opportunity to get back to work. So within that context, the international community can provide significant support, but in partnership with the objectives as identified by national governments and key stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you for that response, Mr. Ellis. Anybody else? Going once? Nope. Okay. I will ask a question here. How do we rapidly get the most in need, those in need, identified and registered for social support? And how do we get them introduced into the banking system for easy delivery of the social support payments? I'm hoping, Ms. Dare Williams, you could help us with that question.
Your question was, how do we get persons to register?
Registered, yes. And how do we get them, I guess, financially included is what the question is asking, so that you can expedite the delivery of the support.
I think it is important that we get persons registered. The challenge is in most of our systems, they are self-reported. So persons will access the system if they think they have a need, and then they will approach the ministry. We have had discussions about how we can broaden that, broaden the system to allow more persons to be registered, so that we can quickly identify persons who are vulnerable. But that is an ongoing discussion. In fact, the recommendation myself made about the social registry is one such solution that we have been contemplating. And it is work in progress, and it is something that we will be pursuing to ensure that we can respond quickly to persons when the need arises.
Thank you, Ms. Dare Williams. Ms. Self, I think that this question is for you. Noting the work that you've done on vulnerable populations, has any research been undertaken on persons with uncertain migration status?
I've seen some research on children, migrant children in Trinidad and Tobago. I didn't come across other bits of research on it in the Caribbean, but during COVID, that is. So that is the extent to which I saw that. Just some research on the impact of migrant children in Trinidad and Tobago.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, how best do we reach and support the informal sector and informal businesses in the economy? Anybody?
So
I can. Oh, go ahead, Miriam. I'll come afterwards.
I'll just give my initial comments, and I guess you can go after Mr. Ellis. So in terms of the informal sector, in some countries, for example, Trinidad and Tobago, self-employed workers are not able to pay into national insurance systems. So they are excluded in one sense, and it's sort of limiting the idea of entrepreneurship. So to have them more included is to ensure that they are able to pay into the national insurance systems. That's one thing. And in some countries, they are able to pay, but they don't. And it could be for many different reasons. Some may not want to pay, but it could be a lack of awareness. And I think that because the pandemic now has underscored the importance of it, I think there's an opportunity for more awareness and just incentivizing them to enter into the social protection for informal workers. Mr. Ellis?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I just want to add to what Miriam would have stated. She's absolutely correct. The crisis has given countries yet another opportunity to help to strengthen the system where those who are in the informal sector, and we know from research and from experience that the informal sector is very significant in the region, and they have been impacted inordinately as a result of the crisis. So communication strategies, incentivizing, as Miriam would have said, and reaching out and getting those informal sector persons to be formalized so that they can participate in the system and accrue benefits when such crisis occurs. So we are talking about building resilience in the system. So we need to get them to a point where they understand that they have a duty and responsibility to participate in the system so that when shocks occur, they have some place to go and they can actually get some benefits after they would have contributed to the national insurance scheme. So those types of platforms have to be used to get persons to formalize their employment to be able to benefit from the system, particularly in times of crisis. Thank you.
If I can just add the
Sure.
Ministry of Labor and Social Security, we have been doing some work on bringing more persons in more of the informal persons into the formality, particularly the domestic workers and the fisher folk. And one of the challenge that we are grappling with is how do we make it easier for them to contribute to the national insurance so that they can benefit in times of need. And we have some programs designed, and I'm sure you will be hearing more about those. So it's something that we have been working on.
Great. Thank you, panel. Let's go to the next question. Could you compare the main social protection measures used in the 4 countries covered in the report and identify any emerging lessons on what approaches are most effective? That's for you, Ms. Sal.
Are you hearing me?
I am, yes.
Okay. So social protection measures. So there would be social assistance and then social insurance. So assistance would be non-contributory support that governments will give to people, for example, free food support. And so we saw in all countries that this was done through different ways. For example, in Trinidad and Tobago, there was the food card. But in Antigua and Barbuda, they would have given packages or so in different ways, but all countries receive food support. That we saw that. And in the survey, we saw that the beneficiaries of those food support included more female-headed households and more poor households. So that was good. And so it says that something went well with the targeting. In terms of social insurance, Barbados is the only country with unemployment insurance out of the 4 countries. So persons in Barbados was able to benefit when they had become unemployed, as we know that happened across all countries. But other countries would have instituted temporary income support measures like Trinidad and Tobago as well as Jamaica. It was more limited in Antigua and Barbuda. But the temporary income support measures, obviously it was for a shorter period, in some cases 3 months, and unemployment went on for longer than that for some persons. And so unemployment insurance system is something that we recommend could be looked into for the other countries beyond Barbados. So those were sort of some of the things that we saw and what was working well.
Chair, could I just come in to add?
Of course, go right ahead.
Thank you very much. I just want to indicate that the research has shown clearly that a number of countries across the region, including the 4 countries in this research, are challenged when it comes to having coordinated and integrated social protection systems. There are a number of challenges. The issue of targeting, some systems don't have a proper monitoring and evaluation system. A number of ministries and agencies are all doing something within social protection. Nobody really knows the impact or the effectiveness of it. So we need a system that can pull the different elements across ministries. We want to have it integrated. Ideally, we want to have a social registry or central beneficiaries system where people are trained, where you have differential access to data, and so on. And very importantly, what the crisis has shown is the imperative of having an unemployment insurance scheme as part of your national insurance framework. Miriam is quite right. Barbados has had a system in place for quite some time, and it served us very well when the crisis hit. It was well capitalized, and it was very useful at that time. Countries across the region have said, you know something, crisis had hit. Countries then had to find a way to access resources, which put significant pressure on their budgets, right? So that is one of the key recommendations. And CDB is in the process of working with some of its member countries to implement an unemployment insurance scheme in collaboration with the ILO. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Sarkhan, Mr. Ellis. And that's very good news that we're broadening this unemployment benefit scheme to other countries in the region with the help of the CDB. The next question is from Delroy Coley, Ministry of Agriculture in Jamaica. He wants to ask, did the research examine government intervention and response to the productive sectors in the economy? Ms. Sal?
So we focused in the research on areas such as food security, income impacts, WASH, that's water, sanitation, and hygiene. And those are some of the areas, education, so on. So if I will just streamline under food security, we just looked at food security from the perspective of, we asked persons in terms of their consumption, if this was affected. We asked them in terms of their access, if can they afford food, and so on. So what we found was that food is available. The issue was not availability of food. So in terms of the agricultural sector, we know that when there was lockdowns, these would have been one of the groups that would have gotten exemptions, or the essential groups, so to speak. So we didn't see an issue with agriculture not being, or food not being available. So it was not a matter of availability, but in terms of access as to whether people can afford it, that was an issue, and their consumption was also affected. So not so much issues on the side of agriculture in terms of what we found with the research.
Chair, we're not hearing you.
Oh, I'm sorry. My apologies. Thanks for letting me know, Ms. Ellis. Thanks for that response, Ms. Sal. So we have a couple more minutes for the Q&A. Let me just ask the next question. National auditors have heavily criticized a number of state social support systems for poor targeting and leakage. So we touched on targeting earlier. And why is this proving so hard to reform? And let me just abuse a little bit my privilege as chair to add on another part of that question, which is, we know we have problems with targeting, and it's certainly not optimal. Was there any thought given and any research done on the current mechanisms that are being used versus what we've seen in other countries, like checks being sent in the mail, universal basic income approaches, etc.? So I guess, Miriam, you could probably kick us off there.
So in terms of targeting, we did see that non-poor households also received support, food support and so on, but it is possible because these households could be on the line of vulnerability and fall into poverty during the crisis, for example. So it was a bit difficult to examine how much leakage there was on that aspect, but we didn't go too much into that. We just know that non-poor households were receiving support as well, but it could be for many different reasons, that they were out of work or so on. And can you repeat the other part of your question, please? Sorry, not hearing you.
My apologies. Thanks for letting me know. Yes, I added on this bit of the question where if we know that targeting is a problem And we seem to have challenges around implementing the necessary reforms in many countries to improve the targeting. Has there been any thought, any countries in the region given any thought and any research done on the effectiveness of other mechanisms that don't quite require maybe as much stringent or difficult targeting, such as what we saw being done in the US, where you mail checks in based on what was your last tax filing, for example. Of course, that will not deal with the informal sector, but also universal basic incomes, etc., where you don't necessarily have this. So in other words, mechanisms where you don't necessarily have as much of a burden of huge administration and therefore problems with targeting. Have there been any, has there been any work and any thought given to these alternative mechanisms?
So in terms of this research, the alternative mechanism that we looked at, it was mentioned already, a social registry. And I just wanted to expand on that a bit, because a central beneficiary system is where you know who actually got benefits already, as opposed to a social registry, which it includes people who did not get benefits as well as who got benefits in the past. But this sort of system is something like, you're working in advance to try to know who the vulnerable people are. And so in this way, they can register into the system for themselves, but you can also do active outreach. And we saw examples in countries like Brazil. They were able to increase their coverage of their social registry with outreach measures, as opposed to people coming and saying, I need to join this system. I need to put my name on this list because, for example, someone asked about persons with disabilities. You need to go and reach them in a lot of cases, So some of them are able to reach out, but they need to be. So in terms of targeting, I think that a system such as the social registry would help with that situation. And so we saw also countries like Colombia, Chile, and Dominican Republic. They have very broad coverage, and during the pandemic, they use a system where they use their social registry to reach out to people as opposed to people applying to them in particular. So that is something that we can really look into in the region.
Great. Thank you. I think that's all we have time for right now in terms of questions. So before I hand over to Dr. King to do his closing remarks, I just want to remind the audience to please go to the Slido poll to look at our second question and to give your responses with respect to, do you have a better understanding of the pandemic's impact on marginalized populations in the Caribbean? And with that, I hand over to Dr. King. I thank, of course, everyone on the panel, and I thank the audience as well for sending in your questions, much appreciated. And let's hand over now to Dr. King.
Thank you so much, Marla. I wonder if we can get 1 minute of closing remarks from each of the panelists before we wrap up finally, starting first with you, Audrey.
So as the ministry charged with the responsibility for bringing social protection to the most vulnerable in Jamaica, we acknowledge that there is room for improvement, but it's something that we are constantly working at. And so some of the issues that were raised earlier this evening are issues that we ourselves are discussing and implementing in some cases. And so we look forward to further discussion on the issues raised and how we can solve some of these issues to make Jamaica the place of choice to live, work, and raise families. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Ellis?
I just want to say that there's no doubt that the pandemic has upended our daily lives. It has thrust us into what commentators are calling a new normal. But despite the fact of the despair, the lingering effects of COVID-19, this pandemic has a silver lining. It has presented some opportunities, and some countries in the region, I think, are jumping on that. They're recognizing the importance of building resilience in their social protection systems, the opportunities to retool those persons who would have been displaced from the labor market, those in the formal and informal sectors, provide opportunities for training in areas that they can participate post-pandemic. I just want to close by saying that when we talk about building resilience, we are talking about putting people at the center of development. And unless we approach sustainable development in a way that looks at inclusive growth and creating opportunities within a good governance framework for persons to participate, we will find ourselves back at square one. So the opportunities are there. CDB is working with its board membership in the OECS and across the region to address some of these challenges that have come to the fore, so these countries can really be resilient when to face the next crisis, whether it be a pandemic, whether it be a hurricane. And in fact, we're on the cusp of hurricane season, and the other crises that await us. But building resilience and reducing risks are important, and CDB is willing to work with its board membership in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Elbert Ellis from the Caribbean Development Bank in Barbados, and to our other panelists, Audrey Dear Williams from the Ministry of Labour and Social Security in Jamaica. And special thanks to Mala Dukaran for moderating our panel this evening, and to our presenter, Miriam Self from Trinidad. The injury of being vulnerable and marginalized is always a struggle and a challenge for those who fall into those groups in Caribbean societies. And to that, the pandemic and the measures to mitigate the pandemic added the insult of making matters worse. All of the governments recognize the need to respond quickly and to respond significantly. But this research has shown that despite the fact that much effort was made, a lot of it did not, in fact, touch the most vulnerable and the most needy. And that is the reason why we had to use this opportunity to examine how it can be better done before the current crisis recedes, and how it can be done even better when the next one hits. We live in a vulnerable part of the world with inherent risks, and so we're going to be facing crises from time to time. That is why this work is important. We have live streamed today from the beautiful AC Hotel here in Kingston. I would like to thank UK Aid, the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, for the support that they give to this work and the other work that CAPRI does. I would also like to thank the good corporate citizens who sponsor a lot of CAPRI's work, in particular Jamaica National Baking Company, and many other companies who show their good corporate citizenship by supporting public policy research. The report, Insult to Injury, the impact of COVID-19 on vulnerable persons and businesses and communities in the Caribbean, is now available on CAPRI's website, capricaribbean.org, and is hereby launched. Please join us for our next event that is going to be on the impact of the COVID pandemic on violence in Jamaica. It will be next week, Thursday, April 29th, and you can watch live and see the starting time on our website at capricaribbean.org. Have a good evening.